Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. What I want to discuss in today's video is a question that I get asked a lot, which is something along the lines of, if there is no self, what is reborn? I think many of us know that rebirth is something that is very important in traditional understandings of the Buddha Dharma. It was certainly something the Buddha taught. And a lot of people get sort of hung up on this very question. And so what I want to do in today's video is to try to give a relatively concise answer to that question along a traditional kind of picture. In other words, what I want to do is to be looking back at the early texts in particular, the texts that we can say sort of originated a lot of these ideas. What did they have to say about this question? What can we understand from a traditional perspective? That's what's going to be the focus of today's video. And so along those lines, what I want to do is to take this in sort of two parts, because this question I've just given really has two parts to it. The first part, that is to say, if there is no self, well, what does that mean? How do we understand that? And then the second part, what is reborn? Okay, and I think both of these you have to give answers to both of them to really understand what's going on here from an early Buddhist perspective. And then at the end of the video, I'll say just a couple of words about sort of my own take on all of these complicated matters. So to begin with, this question of if there is no self. Now, I've done a video on this topic. I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes. But in a nutshell, the Buddha never comes out and baldly says there is no self. Instead, he has a nuanced kind of view about what the self is. Instead of saying something like there is no self, what the Buddha instead talks about is something we could term non-self. That is to say, he asks us to undertake a practice really, of looking at and considering all of the different sense data that comes into us, the things that we see, the things that we hear, the things that we taste and touch, and so on. And then asks us to contemplate each of those and to understand that none of the things that we're experiencing in daily life are a self or are our self. Why is that? Well, because the Buddha says these things that we experience are always changing. And so they don't fit the model of what in ancient India was considered relevant to a self. In ancient India, the idea was that the self was, to begin with, what we might term a locus of perfect control, something over which we have perfect control, that we can stop it at will, we can start it at will, we can make it do what we want. None of our experiences are like that. Similarly, the self is supposed to be something in ancient India that's permanent, that's a place of perfect bliss. And again, nothing that we experience is like that. Nothing that we experience is a permanent location of perfect bliss. Everything is always changing. Further, and in a certainly different route, we might say that the Buddha doesn't say that there isn't a self, because the Buddha is very, very interested in this notion of karma, of karmic continuity in some sense. That is to say that the things that we do now will redound upon us, will affect us in some sense of us in the future. If we do things that are skillful, we will expect a pleasant future in some respects. If we do things that are unskillful, we can expect danger or harm to us in the future. And if there were nothing whatever to a self, if there truly were no self at all, then there could be no way for karma to really work. No way for us to say that there was some sense of us experiencing the effects of the karmic effects of our actions. So, okay, given that there is some idea of a self, what is this? Well, in a nutshell, these are what we might call the five aggregates that are interrelated along the lines of the laws of dependent origination. Now, what I've just said there is a lot to unpack. It involves a lot of technical terminology in early Buddhism. And again, I've done videos on all of this. I'll leave links to them down below, but I do want to say a few words for those of you who are not familiar with these ideas. The 5 aggregates are just a way that the Buddha carves up the mind and body into parts. That is to say, form, which is bodily form, we might say the physical body, that's one of the things that makes up who we are. Feelings, that is to say positive and negative, perceptions, volitions, that is what we do, and consciousness. These 4 mental aggregates and the 1 physical aggregate, that makes up sort of who we are. The laws of dependent origination, there's too much to go into there, but basically it's a causal picture of the way that these aggregates sort of produce one another and interrelate over time. At least that's one of the ways to see the laws of dependent origination. There are many ways to see it. So, but generally the picture here is of a causally connected stream or series of mental and physical states that come and go. None of them are permanent. They're always passing and being reborn and sort of coming and going as we live our lives. And the same way that, we can call this kind of thing a stream of causes and conditions. That's what a person is, quote unquote. Now, let's talk about streams, right? In the case of a stream, a literal stream, a stream of water, we know that it's not a permanent thing. It's always changing. It's different in one place in the stream than another. And yet, at the same time, conventionally, we have no trouble saying that it's a stream, saying that it's the same stream, saying it's the same stream upstream and downstream. We can talk about different parts of the same stream, and I think all of us know what we mean when we talk about that. We talk about one part of the Ganges and another part of the Ganges, or one part of the Mississippi and another part of the Mississippi. That's the unproblematic way that we talk about a conventionally true thing, like a stream. In the same way, we talk about the conventional person, and we can talk about that person having a childhood, an adulthood, and an old age. It's the same person, quote unquote, the same stream over time, even though there's nothing permanent there. There's nothing that literally remains absolutely the same moment to moment, just the same as the stream. Okay, so now this gives us a picture of what the self is like in Buddhism. It's not that there's literally no self, it's rather that there's no permanent self, and that the self that we talk about is sort of a conventional understanding of this kind of stream of causes and conditions. So, now we turn to the second part of this question, which is, what is reborn? Now, there's the picture we get in early Buddhism about rebirth, literal rebirth, is not very well explained, I'll put it that way. However, the Buddha does talk about the fact that conception, human conception, requires 3 things, and one of these things is called the gandhabba. That is the Pali term that's used. Now, ordinarily, a gandhabba is a name for a certain kind of celestial being, a being that supposedly plays music and so on, among other things. Now, and we might think from that story that what the Buddha is telling us here is that in order for there to be human conception or any kind of conception, there must be kind of the intercession of some kind of celestial being. However, that's not really how it's described in the early texts. Instead, this gandhabba, this term, seems to be a technical term in the early texts for something that we might call rebirth consciousness, for want of a better phrase. We get a picture of this in one early sutta where the Buddha is debating a Brahmin about the caste system. And in this early sutta, the Brahmin is arguing for the superiority of the Brahmin caste because according to the Vedic account, that is to say, the account that we find in these very early Indian religious texts, the Vedas, according to that account, the Brahmins were born from the mouth of Brahma, the deity, whereas the other castes were born from other parts of this deity that were less exalted than the mouth. To counter this claim of the Brahmin, the Buddha says that in fact all Brahmins are born the same way that any other human is born, and it's not from the mouth. Okay, so the Buddha is making a very strong claim here, a very obvious claim. But the Buddha goes on to say that in the case of all these people, they require this gandhabba that we've just talked about. And further, the Buddha says that we don't know the caste of that gandhabba in any case, in the case of any person who's being born, in case of any case of human conception, we don't know the caste of the gandhabba. And the Brahmin agrees. The Brahmin agrees, yes, we don't know the caste of this gandhabba. There's no way for us to know. But then the Buddha goes on to say that if we don't know the caste of that gandhabba, we don't really know the caste of anybody, because they could be coming from any caste. And I think this argumentative move, this argument between the Brahmin and the Buddha makes the most sense if we understand this gandhabba to be this rebirth consciousness that I've talked about. This idea that this gandhabba is really the consciousness of some prior person, again, whose caste we can't know, that is being reborn in this particular case. And indeed, in one Chinese parallel to these Pali texts, I mean, I've been talking about Pali, early Buddhist texts that are composed in the Pali language, but these texts were then translated a long time ago into Chinese. And indeed, in one Chinese parallel to one of these texts, the term that is used as gandhabba in the Pali text is actually translated in the Chinese text by the phrase aspiring consciousness. That is to say, a consciousness, again, that aspires to be reborn. So again, we have some idea way back in the day, from many centuries, millennia ago, that they were understanding it the same way I've been talking about, that this is a kind of an aspiring consciousness from the prior lifetime. Elsewhere, in a very famous early text where the Buddha discusses dependent origination, called the Mahadidana Sutta, the Buddha discusses a similar kind of issue with his close attendant Ananda. And here the Buddha asks, if consciousness were not to descend or enter into the mother's womb, would name and form arise there? And here we can understand name and form as kind of a gloss over this idea of the five aggregates. There are lots of ways of understanding name and form, but the idea is that it's the body and the mind together, or some understanding of it in that regard. There's a lot of dispute over what name and form really means, but I think the general picture here is clear. That if consciousness was not to descend into the mother's womb, as the Buddha is saying, would name and form arise? Would the fetus actually take form? And the answer here is no, that it would not. At least that's the picture we get in this particular sutta. So here we have a pretty clear picture of what's going on here, of consciousness entering the womb. However, we should not, and this is critical here, we should not understand this consciousness to be a permanent thing. It's not a permanent thing that goes through from one life into another. We know that from a different sutta that I've discussed actually in a prior video, where a monastic named Sati the fisherman's son, makes that claim, that is to say that the consciousness is absolutely the same, unchanging and permanent, that persists from one life into the next, and the Buddha chastises him pretty severely for that claim. What the Buddha says is this: consciousness itself is dependently originated, since consciousness does not arise without a cause. And I'll leave a link to that video down below if you want to hear more about that. But in general, the picture here that we should understand is that consciousness is something that arises due to causes and conditions, eventually decays and falls away, and is replaced by a different kind of consciousness. That's the picture over time. So the consciousness is always coming and going. Part of that process, at least in the traditional understanding, involves rebirth as well. So to return to our question, if there is no self, what is reborn? Well, what we want to say here, what we should say if we want to understand the picture in early Buddhism, is that it's not that there is no self at all, but rather that there's nothing permanent. There's no permanent self. What there is a conventional series, or I should say a series of causes and conditions, of mental and physical events that make up a stream that we conventionally call a person. And that part of that stream involves consciousness coming and going, and that over time, that the consciousness may be reborn, or at least momentary parts of consciousness may be causally reborn into the next life. And so while there is no literal thing that is reborn, there is no permanent thing that is reborn into the next life, what we have here is a picture of a series of causes and conditions that preserves sort of our karmic baggage, such that the stream downstream, shall we say, will receive the benefits or the harm that were laid down by what was going on upstream, shall we say. That's the sort of picture that we get. And it's the same picture within a lifetime as between lifetimes. In other words, the picture doesn't change if we're talking about within a particular lifetime. Nothing persists from our youth to our middle age to our old age. There's nothing permanent there. All there is a series of causes and conditions. Now, having said all of that, what I would say is that from my own personal point of view, I find the picture, or at least the picture that we're given about what happens between lifetimes, to be very speculative. I don't see any evidence for it in my own life. I don't know of any good evidence for it, except for what we read in early suttas and some, again, speculative accounts. So I tend to leave these points aside in my own practice. In other words, my own practice is based around what happens in this life, and if there is rebirth, okay, then maybe it goes on the way the Buddha said. It certainly could. And if there's not rebirth, well, at least I will have lived a good life as much as I can. That said, I think whether or not we accept this view of rebirth, it's important for us at least to understand what the Buddha said and what the picture is in a traditional understanding. Because otherwise, a lot of people, I think, get confused about it. A lot of people don't understand it, and so either turn away from Buddhism simply because they don't understand what's being said, or they get confused by it, and so it becomes a stumbling block on their practice. So what I hope to have done at least is to relieve us of one of these stumbling blocks, and then we can decide to make of it what we will. Now, I did I've done a number of earlier videos on this, but I'll leave a link to one of them where I discuss, up here on the screen, where I discuss some aspects of rebirth, at least in my understanding, sort of going a little bit farther on a lot of this discussion. So if you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much for your support and your help and for watching these videos, and we'll catch you on the next one.